This is English version of this podcast. To jest angielska wersja tego podcastu. Jeżeli wolicie posłuchać po polsku, ściągnijcie tą drugą wersję.
Mądrze Gada. Rozmowy z ludźmi, którzy wiedzą, co mówią.
Okay then. Hello, you're listening to another of our podcasts. My name is Tomasz Oryński and I have a guest for you today who has the best job ever. He rides trains, rides bicycle and visits places in all of Europe and then writes on social media and blogs about trains. But I guess there is something more to it. So let me introduce John Ward and maybe John, you tell more how you became basically a train expert.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invite, Thomas. Essentially, I come from outside the railway industry. I'm an independent communications consultant. I've been teaching and working Europe-wide, and I wanted to travel in a green way and get to all of my work contracts Europe-wide without flying. And I kept on getting stuck. Things didn't work. And I started to ask myself the question, well, who's actually trying to fix the politics of Europe's railways? And the answer is no one really. And then I eventually started to ask myself the question, well, maybe I should do something. And out of that has come a whole series of projects to try to basically make it easier for people to cross borders in Europe by train. And while it might be a nice thing to do, it's a bit of a difficult thing to finance. My projects are mostly crowdfunded, so it's not easy to live off this railway work. Although, of course, when it does work and I go to nice places, it is a lot of fun.
Yeah, but before we go to this technicalities, let's put one thing aside or maybe forward. See, I always wanted to travel by train, but I was mostly, when I lived in Britain, I was in a very good financial situation. For many years, I was a student, and of course, I was working, then I was having some other difficulties. And I always wanted to travel from Scotland to Poland on the train, and I simply could never afford it because while driving my car from Poland to Scotland or other way around, it was depends on the fuel price at the time. You could easily do it in under £200 with ferries included and everything. And the cheapest train ever I managed to find was 320 per person per one way, which I couldn't afford because there was two of us. And guess what was the cheapest Ryanair ticket I ever flew from Scotland to Poland?
Oh, it was probably £10 or something.
No, it was 99 pence.
Oh,
it was 2009 or something. So it was 99 pence a ticket. I got it at least twice. So tell me, why railway is so expensive in the first place? Surely planes cannot be cheap.
Right. So it's a bit more complicated than it sounds. And some of the reasons are actually quite sensible as to why trains are quite expensive. So basically, a lot of the costs involved in flying a plane are involved in the airports, and a relatively low percentage of the total cost is actually the distance that you cover. When you run a train, the train has to pay a charge to access the tracks, add more kilometers of tracks, and so your cost goes up. So the cost structure, you have lower fixed costs and more costs per kilometer than flying a plane, right? So that basically means once you start to get up beyond the cost of, say, a distance of 2,000 or 3,000 kilometers, your train in Europe anyway gets prohibitively expensive. So that's the reason why railway companies can't offer you a 99-cent ticket. Second, and this is when it starts to get really interesting, even for shorter journeys, you would say, well, hey, hang on a minute, why is Edinburgh to London crazy expensive? Well, the answer is the trains are full, so the train can be that expensive. So ultimately, I hear very often, we should make trains cheaper. But the railway companies, although they'd never say it so bluntly, they would say, well, why the hell should we make trains cheaper? Our trains are full anyway. Right? Now, You or I may say, well, okay, make the trains cheaper, more people would take them, and then you create a positive cycle that the railway industry would then transport more people, and we create a positive cycle and everything would get better. But unfortunately, for some of the reasons we'll discuss throughout this podcast, the railway industry doesn't really think that way. So it's one of the things that I'm coming up against over and over is to try to facilitate cross-border rail. Before you talk about making it cheaper, you actually need to run more trains. To run more trains, you need more lines, you might need more trains themselves, you might need operators that recruit more staff, and all of that comes up against opposition within the railway industry. So ultimately, it's a cost structure problem, and it's a capacity problem, because on many of the key routes, notably from the UK, the Eurostar route from London to Brussels and Paris, already comparatively full, and so therefore those companies can get away with setting very high prices.
Okay, but is that also about profits? Because like railway is considered to be like for-profit enterprise, while like roads aren't really for profits. Like I hear all the time, like we cannot renovate this railway line or that railway line because it will never be profitable. I never heard someone saying, oh, we cannot build a road here because only 50 person lives in this village and it won't be profitable to build a road here. So why is railway a business and roads are like public service that can come as at a loss? Because still, again, like you say, like when you compare the flying to railways, you said that railway pays for the infrastructure and everything. But if I pack myself into a pallet and send myself on a truck, I can like reach Poland at fraction of the price of the railway ticket. So how is that I can send a ton pallet at fraction of the price that's sending a person by train?
Well, railways have, in large parts of Europe, lost this sort of public service ethos, right? Like that this is a service which is provided at a fair cost to local people. Now, it's not only a case of public versus private, because actually there are some parts of Europe where there's some private enterprises in railways, and actually the costs are still comparatively low, parts of Czechia, for example. And there are other places, France most notably, where the railways are still in private hands, but extremely expensive, in state hands, but extremely expensive to take. Now, what you've ultimately got is all of the railway companies need investment in lines. They need to renovate their existing infrastructure. And they struggle to get enough public investment from the state to actually do those works. And as a result, you have this weird deal, basically, between the railway industries and transport ministries, where transport ministries say, well, we are going to subsidize your operations less. We are going to invest less in your tracks. And railway companies, how do they respond? They ultimately go along with that reduced subsidy. They increase the prices for passengers, and you end up being in a negative cycle. And so ultimately, to put this right, you need a socially orientated railway policy, which very, very few European countries really have, right? Finland, where you're based now, has it a bit. Poland, where you're originally from, has it a bit. UK definitely has lost it. France has mostly lost it. It depends a bit where you are in Europe about whether that is still there. Is this a service for a low price that anyone can use? And largely across most of Europe, regardless of who actually literally owns or runs the trains, that public service ethos is gone from railways. And that has been done with the participation of the railway companies together with the ministries of transport.
Okay, but I want to clarify something, because you said that like railway companies and trucks, but correct me if I'm wrong, but I think under European law now the companies that run trains are to be separated from the companies or institutions that maintain the rail tracks. So it should work in theory as the roads work, that the roads are available to everyone and everyone can set up a company driving buses on this road as long as they pay tolls. So this is the same situation with the railway now, yes?
It is theoretically the same situation with the railway. But it is easier said than done. All right. in some parts of Europe, and particularly with freight trains, right, it already works comparatively well. You have lots of different private and state operators crossing borders. That largely works. For passenger trains, it's much harder, particularly for long distance and higher speed passenger trains. The cost of acquisition of such a train is very high. And then you need to get your train individually approved so it can run in more countries, because unlike roads where basically the same bus can run on a road from the north of Finland right the way to Portugal, in railways you have multiple electrification systems. There are 4 main electrification systems in Europe. And although you can overcome that one, you have the difficulty that there are more than 10 signaling systems. So your train, if it wants to run on an international route, needs to actually be technologically quite complicated. And so it's quite difficult if you're a kind of a new startup company of some sort to actually try to even literally purchase the trains to allow you to run those trains Europe-wide.
Mm-hmm. And because if I may to interrupt you a bit, with train signaling, it's not like with a car, you drive a car and there is like semaphore and you can see if it's red or green. It's much more complicated. There are some special sensors which work with the train. They are like signals that display in the cab for the driver. So it is much more complicated than just sticking up the semaphore and showing the signal to passing trains.
Right. Although it must be said that running up to 160 kilometers an hour, you can still do it with comparatively basic sensors and lights along the track, right? Not quite as simple as a traffic light, but a comparatively simple system. Once you get above 160 kilometers per hour, then you get into a much more complicated environment where you need much more expensive onboard systems. Not least, also, you have to bear in mind that the braking distance for a train is very long because it's much greater weight and it's much lower friction between the wheels and the tracks. So it basically means you can't slow a train down as quickly as you could slow down a truck or a bus. And that therefore means that the necessary safety systems for the signaling have to be that much more for longer distances than is the case on a road. So that adds additionally to the cost. Now, the European Union knows this. It's building a unified signaling system, but the railway companies are very slow to adopt this unified signaling system, which is called ETCS.
Yes, and apart from this, I heard that there's also a problem with languages, that the drivers needs to speak local languages. So if you drive a train, say from my hometown of Wrocław to Budapest, the train driver should speak Polish, Czech, and Hungarian. Or you can change the driver at every border, but then this driver had to be trained in like this kind of train engine, which may not be like local to Hungary. Or you can like send a classic train and change the locomotive at every border, which will take ages. So because of this lack of integration of the systems, the travel across the borders, it's much more complicated.
Exactly. So that's all correct. Although it must be said that at some borders that works better than others. You generally have the situation where you can, at least without the local language, can travel to the first station after the border in most cases. Although at the moment, even that is broken down at the France-Spain border, for example. So ultimately, there are many technical hurdles to overcome, which if you are a company with the right attitude and with deep pockets financially, you can overcome these hurdles. But there are many people within the railway industry that mitigate against overcoming these hurdles, do not want to fix those problems, and would sooner protect their national markets and protect their national monopolies rather than actually putting these problems right Europe-wide, either for passengers or for freight.
Why is that? Is that because, say, if I'm PKP, the Polish railways, I'm afraid that if I make it easier for Czech railways to enter, then the czeskie drachy will push me out of the market because they are better, or?
It's not český dráhy that PKP is worried about. Not directly, anyway.
Yeah, it was just a random example.
No, but it's an important point. Because, so, you traditionally have, although it's broken somewhat, one main state-owned operator in each country, although in Poland that's got a little bit messy with the breakup of PKP, and there are now some regional operators as well. But anyway, generally there's one state operator. And then there are normally some private rivals. And each country, there is often a tense relationship between the state operator and its private rivals. So in Czechia, for example, that's České dráhy, a state operator, against RegioJet and Leo Express, two private operators. So what PKP in Poland is scared of is not the other state operator from the other side of the border. It's actually that the Czech private operator would muscle in on Polish lines. Right?
Mm-hmm.
In Italy, it is Trenitalia that is scared of Italo, its private rival. In Austria, it's the state-owned ÖBB, which is scared of Westbahn, the private rival. In Germany, it's Deutsche Bahn, which is scared of Flixtrain, the spin-off of Flixbus, the bus operator, that Deutsche Bahn is worried about. Now, and indeed, at some borders, it's actually the state operator is scared of another state operator. So between France and Italy, it's French SNCF, the state operator that doesn't get along with the Italian state operator, Trenitalia. So ultimately, these animosities between these state-owned companies, either among themselves or from a state-owned company to a private company, often are what prevents collaboration in border regions. You don't collaborate with a company on the other side of the border because you see that as kind of like a thin end of the wedge. If we collaborate with you, we'll have to collaborate with everyone, and we would sooner collaborate with no one. Right?
Okay.
It sounds ridiculous, but ultimately that is what drives the mentality of many big state-owned railway firms.
Okay, but I can see why that can be, and I give you an example of the buses from Poland. So we used to have this like state bus operator, PKS, and they were like going to every single village. And then when the privatization happened after, obviously, in 1989, then a lot of private companies started, and they took up the most profitable lines at most profitable times, and leaving PKS to pick up the least profitable lines, like going to the smaller villages or like 5 in the morning or 11 in the evening runs, which meant that they had to compete with those companies on this most profitable relations, while having to use the profits from these profitable relations to subsidize these services that were not profitable. Which brings us to my original question. Wouldn't that be much easier if the railway was treated as a service and not as a business? Because if we want to provide like reliable service to everywhere, well, at least everywhere reasonable, we cannot just allow the private companies to battle for the most profitable roads and leave like state operators to pick up the ones that nobody else wants to operate.
It's not as bad as you say, right? So, forget the British situation, which is rather different, right? And come to what happens in Germany, right? So, you have in Germany a clear distinction between regional trains and long-distance trains. Regional trains are done using a competitive tendering model where state and private companies bid to run the lines. And how many trains run and the tariffs that you have to pay to take one are determined by the public authority that handles the bidding process and therefore sets the tariffs. So, for example, if you go to Berlin main station, you have predominantly 2 operators of the regional trains. There are red ones run by Deutsche Bahn, the state-run operator that won the tender for some of the lines. And there is white and yellow and green ones run by a private operator called Ode that runs some of the other lines. But in terms of the cost per kilometer for the passenger, it is the same, regardless of whether the train is run by Deutsche Bahn or whether the train is run by Ode. Now, that basically says these things are run in the public interest, but whether the operator is state or the operator is private, it doesn't matter. And what you've basically done there is actually create a competitive market in order to win those tenders. And those competitive tenders have, generally speaking, driven down the cost of operating regional lines. You get more trains for less money invested, which, if you are a transport authority, is probably a good thing.
Okay, but you have to explain that to me, because I don't really understand how it works. See, let's stick to Britain, because I'm quite familiar.
Wait. We should not stick to Britain.
Yeah, but
Britain has messed this up royally. Mm-hmm. And so if you take the example of how you liberalized railways in Britain, Britain got the worst of private enterprise and the worst of a monopoly operation.
Okay, so I will tell you what I know about Britain, and you tell me what's the difference between Britain and, say, Germany. So in Britain, the deal is that there's like a tender for servicing the line, and the government sets the timetable. They provide the trains. The trains do not belong to operators. They are like owned by ScotRail, for example, and you can win this tender by offering that you will do it by the least government funding, which is basically, you propose that you will do it as the smallest profit margin, because the tickets prices are also set by the government. So you basically cannot decide anything, and you just compete on price. And then, of course, if you run in trouble, you just give up and hand the trains back to the government, as it happened several times recently with East Coast Line, for example. And why it makes sense? Like, Scotland now nationalized the trains, and they do it.
And it didn't get better.
Well, yes. So why? Because they basically do the same, except they don't have to profit on that and pay the shareholders.
Right.
So why private is better in this matter?
Private is not necessarily better in this matter, right? Now, you have to take a step back here.
Mm-hmm.
If you just have everything owned and run by the state, right, like you have in Switzerland, for example, you can end up with an excellent railway, but often with very high costs.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to have a unitary state-owned railway where the state owns the tracks and operates the trains and sets the prices for the tickets, right? That creates a situation where, for example, the cost of running the workshops to maintain the trains, you have little in the way of cost control, right? Now, conversely, if you have everything run by the private sector, you have a problem that you have a race to the bottom of a poor quality service at the end of the day. Now, you have, if you put this together in the right way, with some state operation and some private operation, and you do it right, you can end up, ideally, with a situation where you keep your costs under control and you can run railways which actually transport a rather large amount of people for a comparatively low price.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what Germany or Czechia, or to some extent Austria, has managed to succeed in doing. Now, for every well-run state-owned railway, like the Swiss, I can point you to a really malevolent, evilly run one, like the French. So this notion, if you take it from real, everyday, lived experience, Europe-wide, right, and I have traveled in every EU country where there is a railway, you end up with a situation where you can't simply say state is better and private is worse, or private is better and state is worse. It just does not match the facts on the ground. There are good state operators and bad ones, and there are good private operators and bad ones, and there are better or worse ways of liberalizing a railway if you wish to do that. And so therefore, if you look at the experience, if you take the best of the experience of some things which have been done in regional railways in Germany, long distance high speed trains in Italy, the provision of information in a liberalized railway in Czechia, you put all of that together and you can make a case to say actually a mixed model of part state, part private is actually not a bad model to operate. Not least because particularly for international routes, if the state-owned railway companies refuse to collaborate with each other, you can have a situation where a private operator can step in and say, okay, well, we will try.
Mm-hmm. So basically, the bottom line here is that while someone may profit on providing the railway connections, the profits that we pay to these private companies will still be cheaper than the wasted costs that are likely to happen if the railway was run by the state only because of competition. Yeah,
it's possible. Yeah, so that's not the case in all cases, but in some cases, yes. Now, if you hear, for example, the opinion of the state-owned railway company České dráhy in Czechia, their head of international affairs says, having private rivals on our network has made us, the state operator, better. Right? The threat of competition has forced the company to become leaner and more flexible, which is probably not a bad thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but let's now head back to this German example. So, like, if I wanted to run a private trains in Britain, I basically can only compete on my profit margins. So, what's the difference in Germany? If I want to run a train
in Germany, well, there are a couple of cases in the UK as well. You can do what is known as open access. You can basically say, "Hey, I want to run a train from A to B. Network operator, have you got a space on your line to give me a path to run my train on this route at this time?" And the network operator might say, "No, sorry, you can't do that because we haven't got capacity." Or the network operator says, "Sure, we've got capacity. Providing your train respects our safety and security norms, here, run." And you pay a charge to access the track, and you pay a charge to access the stations. What you can also do as the state is change those access charges according to the time of day so as to prioritize the type of services that you want to see. So, for example, maybe your network is quite empty late in the evening. Make the routes very cheap then, and maybe a low-cost operator steps in and runs services for students in the late evening hours, which allows students to get home cheaply, for example. So there's a way and means that you can work with those charges to kind of shape the type of service that you actually want to see. So that's actually an important lever that the state would still have. But that's the basis of, for example, Flixbus, when it wanted to make a train operation now known as Flixtrain in Germany. It said, okay, we want to run something which is faster than a bus, but is not as deluxe as Deutsche Bahn's trains. They went to the network operator, asked for paths, asked for access to stations, paid those dues to the network operator, and now they run dozens of trains every day across Germany. That is what eventually will happen in Poland. It is what already happens in Italy. It already happens in Austria. It's been a little bit slower to come to some other parts of Europe. It doesn't yet happen, for example, in Portugal or in Croatia, and it hasn't for passenger trains happened in Finland yet either.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and the second option, because that's basically the open access, but the second option, I guess there are some franchises in Germany as well.
Yeah. And so these franchises are for regional operations. They're not for long distance operations. So therefore, trips of up to 100 kilometers. And so you have multiple operators which are competing to run these operations. And of course, there have been a few stories where some of those companies have gone bankrupt. But what the authorities that give those contracts have ultimately learned is to set the available price carefully at the beginning in order to manage to make sure that actually you don't simply have a race to the bottom in terms of the quality of the provision in those cases. So pretty much everywhere all across Germany, you see many of the regional trains are no longer run by Deutsche Bahn, but they're run by a series of different operators. One of the biggest operators, quite interestingly, although you won't see their logo on the train, is actually the Italian State Railways owns many of the German regional operators. So you have an Italian state-owned company which is running regional trains in Germany, which I think is quite an interesting development.
Okay, so that's about the local ones, but now let's go to, I guess, one of your favorite topics, which is international train travel. And let's start with something that I remember from since I was a kid and I was traveling by trains, which is the crazy prices for trains that go across the border. So if I travel like 200 kilometers from, say, my hometown to the Czech border, or I travel 200 kilometers in Czech Republic, it is much cheaper than if I travel 200 kilometers across the border. And I remember when we were kids or teenagers, when we were traveling to Slovakia to see the mountains from the other side, we were traveling to Chałupki. Then in the middle of the night, we were getting out of the train, like the whole class excursion was getting out of the train, walking like 2 kilometers or whatever it was to Bohumin, and getting back on the same train who was held at the border for so long because of the passport control. And that way we could save a fortune just by walking 2 kilometers on the border. So why is that? If I travel Flixbus from, say, Helsinki, I think there's now some crazy one from Tampere to Hanover or whichever, which like travels through several countries. Like there are toll systems in every of these countries. There are different toll systems, different charges for using bus stops, bus stations, and yet I can buy a simple Flixbus ticket. And why is so crazy with trains?
But Flixbus is reacting to the market. Right? It's reacting like a private operator, basically. It's essentially setting the price that the market will bear.
Yeah, but what I mean is like why the buying ticket for international bus is simple, and why I cannot just go online and buy easily the ticket for international travel, and I have to use like there's this guy who makes a living with explaining how to buy tickets. You know, the seat 61.
Yeah, man, in seat 61. Right?
Yeah.
So look, it's back to national monopolies again, right? And how are those national state-owned companies politically controlled or controlled by their customers, right? So, let me give you an example. The high-speed trains that run from Paris to Brussels and Paris to Lille, right, in northern France, right? It's a large city in northern France. These trains take 75% the same track, right? Basically, Lille is pretty much on the way. But the cost of the tickets to Brussels is always at least double or more than the cost of the ticket to Lille, right? Despite, based on what we've just been talking about earlier on, the track access charges are not double. Right? They're a little bit more because the distance is a little bit further, but they are not double. Why is this? Because there is no political accountability if it is an international train. Why does SNCF set a relatively low price for Lille? Because if they set a high price, it would be in the French media. This is a scandal that it costs too much to go to France's 5th largest city. This is unacceptable. We need to fix it. In which newspaper does anyone write, it's a scandal that it costs too much to go from London to Brussels? The French go, it's all those tax exiles that escaped to Belgium to live there. And the people going from Belgium to Paris, it's a bunch of rich bureaucrats that don't have any public discussion about it costing too much to cross that border, right? Or another one, if you want to cross the border from France to Germany at Strasbourg, all of the cheap tickets in Alsace, they work to Krimery-Mainau, the last station in France. All of the cheap tickets in Germany, they work from Kehl, the first station in Germany, but they don't work on the 4 kilometers on the border in between. when I have posed this problem to politicians, including members of the European Parliament that work in Strasbourg, right, and travel across that border, yes, we see your problem, but it's too complicated to fix, they tell me. Right? Now, you have to understand the problem as politicians before you can begin to fix it. How many politicians active in European railway policy know this type of problem? Pretty much none.
But
and so you have no political pressure to solve a problem like that. And indeed, craziest of all, Belgium, they just launched a new train, starts in Liège in Belgium, it goes to Maastricht in Netherlands, and it then finally ends up in Aachen in Germany. It's called the 3-country train. And they launched the train, and only then did they realize you couldn't actually buy a ticket for the entire train. Because no one had thought of that, right?
I remember
that's how messed up the railway company is. We launched a 3-country train, but we haven't got a 3-country ticket for it. Yeah. Now, these types of things drive you crazy. And the amount of kind of tricks you have to pull, you buy a ticket to the last station before the border and then one from the first station across.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask now, because I remember I have a friend who was Polish, but she lived in East Germany and she was traveling a lot from Wrocław when she studied to her home in East Germany. And I was like 20 something years, so I don't know if that's still a case, but she was buying a ticket to Zgorzelec and then she was buying a ticket from Gerlitz to her destination. And she was basically running over the border without paying, which was like 2 kilometers or something. Because even if they would catch her, which would never happen, they would just sell her a ticket on the train with some penalty charge and it would still be worth it because if she bought these 2 separate tickets, it was like 40% of the total ticket from Wrocław to her destination in Germany. So why there's like this special ticket just for crossing the border? You don't have that on the buses.
No politicians give a damn. That's the reason. Now,
but let's leave. The politicians are like next level. I'm trying to find why there is a thing like that in the first place. Why there's like cross-border tickets.
So it is not from malevolence, mostly. It's from incompetence and a lack of customer friendliness. So, for example, right, your question of Wrocław to Zgorzelec, the tickets on the Polish side the price is not set by the railway company. It will be set by the Public Transport Authority of Lower Silesia. Right? They will say, we want to set the ticket price at whatever amount per kilometer or from this part of the region to this other part of the region. This is how much it will be. And if that does not cover the cost of running the train, they will give the train operator a subsidy. That's how it will work.
Yes, and just to on technicalities in Poland, there's this thing I like that further you travel, the cheaper each kilometer is. So that's
right, exactly.
Yeah.
And there are lots of railway companies that operate that, so that's fine. Like I have no problem with that, right? But when they did their tariff system, did they remember that there is a train that literally crosses the bridge and goes to Görlitz? No. Well, actually, Görlitz is a bad example because they have actually fixed that one. But there is another border a little bit north of there, the border at Forst-Lausitz, which goes to Cottbus, based on the line from Żary in Poland to Cottbus. There, not only did they not calculate the tariff, but you cannot buy an online ticket for the 4 kilometers for the border section. They just forgot it. They just never calculated it. So you have the situation where often no one has thought to put this problem right. No one has the will, the leverage, the determination to fix it.
So basically, before we go to politics, it's about lack of cooperation between this like railway authorities because they only think inside their country. It's like with this road, you probably have seen the memes recently, like Poland has completed the expressway from the sea to the Czech border, and the expressway like ends in the field. Like you drive dual carriageway and then it just cuts
Then
off
bam.
and there's just field on the Czech side. So this is basically that,
The
but for
same with
trains.
railways.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Like, and I have loads of photos of like, literally you see where the border is and the track is renovated on one side of the border and then suddenly it turns to shit the moment that you cross. So yeah, that happens in railways all the time.
Yeah, it's actually the Western Poland is a good example of that because I've been in railway college in the 90s, and even then it was always the problem because for Poland, like direction west is very important direction. So we were like maintaining and renovating our railway lines towards German border to the highest standard. We had like electrification done and everything. And then for Germans, like some trains going to east, they don't care about them. So they were doing nothing with those rails. So it was actually funny when you were driving a train to this like mythical west when everything is supposed to be better. You were crossing the border from Poland into Germany and suddenly the train infrastructure was totally crap. So that was years and years ago.
Yeah. So there's the case now that the craziest of all is Zaglozolet to Görlitz. Poland has electrified its line and they've built the electrification masts to the middle of the bridge as a provocation towards Germany, because Germany did not begin to electrify its line. So there's like these masts which end in the middle of the bridge, like right over the Neisse River.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's the technicalities. But you already started ranting about politicians, so let's go that route because I guess you have a lot to say about them.
Yeah.
Because politicians don't care, but like if I may suggest a direction, is that because there is like no voice of railway passengers? Like every politician is scared about car drivers. And they won't dare to do anything to worsen like car travel, like see how much opposition there's every time like there are congestion charges or tolls or even speeding tickets when they are raised, how heavy it is for politicians to do. So is that the case that politicians don't care about trains because train passengers have no voice?
Yes, that's a very important and very central point. And train passengers often nationally have a bit of a voice. There are often passenger rights associations in individual countries, but they often don't care about the international aspect of solving these problems. That's the first. And the second is you need to understand the problem before you can fix it. And the really depressing thing I've encountered in all my railway work is when I go and talk to politicians or even go and talk to officials about this, is they often tell me, but we didn't know it was so bad. It's like, hey, you're relying on some independent campaigner guy to go and tell you how bad the situation is on the ground. Now, that has been really disappointing and it's been quite a sort of eye-opening situation. I assumed that, at least within the EU, that the European Commission knew where the problems were, but didn't think it could fix them. But I've ultimately come to the point of view that actually most of the time the European Commission doesn't even know where the problems are. And indeed then the most important thing I would say is if you as a politician would want to fix these problems is first of all, go to the ground, go and meet the people who rely on these services and then begin to work out what they'd actually need in order to manage to fix them. So yeah, there's no passenger rights lobby really. And there is a lack of understanding from politicians and officials about what the problems really are.
Okay, and there's one thing I also notice about politicians. Politicians love, at least in Poland and in Britain as well, as you probably know, love to speak about high-speed trains because they are like shiny and swift and look space age and everything. But do we really need to focus on high-speed trains? Like, can we at least start making the trains we already have reliable and good, like transport options? And also, like, I don't really need to travel 300 kilometers per hour because long distance, because then I would ride on this train all day, and then I will have to go to the hotel anyway. I would rather ride on the sleeper train, which can drive like 160 kilometers, and then I will sleep on it, so I won't need a hotel. And I see European Union is working towards this rebuilding networks of the sleeper train, and
Sort of.
well, they do nice pictures of the networks. So
Yeah, right.
at least they are talking about that. So let's talk about that.
They're talking about it.
Mhm.
So I think there is definitely a bias towards big city connections and high-speed trains for two reasons. First, that's what the railway industry wants, and it's together with that, it's what the building industry wants, right? And then it reflects politicians' own biases, because they are mostly people and officials that travel between big cities. Second, doing works to improve an existing network, it takes a long time, it's hard and it's complicated, and often you don't get much political credit for putting those things right. And so there is this bias towards big, sexy projects rather than actually smaller scale, longer term projects that actually put a lot of problems right on the ground. Now, actually, I must say, although Poland is now thinking about building this kind of grand central airport project and connecting all with high-speed trains, Poland has actually done a lot of good work improving local lines. So actually, if you look at all of the lines in southern Poland between Wrocław and Krakow, for example, or via Katowice, all of that has been done improving and speeding up existing lines instead of building new. And I think that's actually a very, very good policy that Poland has pursued there. But yeah, generally speaking, I agree with that point. Now, what about night trains? The difficulty with night trains is the operational costs and the operational complexity are quite difficult, because the train generally transports fewer passengers than a train with seats in it. And as a result of the track access charges being calculated by distance, it means running night trains in a profitable manner is quite difficult. And so ultimately, trying to then get night train operations to work in a way where they do not need a public subsidy for their operation is a problem that's not yet been solved by the European Union. Now, I think the European Union should look at the side of purchasing or building the trains, and then the operational side could solve itself, but we're not there yet.
Mhm. But they do something about that apart from publishing those
No.
wish list maps and
Not
everything?
really.
Not really, no.
Not mostly because European Union railway policy at the moment is still largely dominated by the wishes of the big railway companies. And the big railway companies largely don't like night trains because they are complicated to operate. They are almost by definition international because they travel on such a long route that probably they will cross a border somewhere. And they don't fit into this kind of profit-orientated high-speed model. And so therefore, the big companies, notably Deutsche Bahn and French SNCF, they have no interest in night trains at all. And so they could do it, but don't want to. And the small operators, particularly private ones like European Sleeper, this Netherlands startup, for example, they want to, but they don't have the financial means. So basically, those that could don't want to, and those that want to can't. And that's a bit the bind that we are stuck in at the moment with regard to the future of night train.
Mhm. Okay, let's go back to Southwest Poland, as you mentioned. I can agree with you that Koleje Dolnośląskie, which is like regional government-owned train company in Southwest Poland, they are a big success story. Yeah. Although we have to say they have it relatively easy because the density of network at Lower Silesia is really high, and most of those lines were still in passenger use at least till 20 years ago, and many of them still had some cargo operation. So it's relatively easy to put back passenger trains on them. But still, if you live in the region, I guess it's much important for you to have a train from, I don't know, Lubawka to Marciszów than to know that there is a TGV train from Paris to Wrocław, because you probably never use the latter, and the former you can use to commute to your work, to school, and so on every day. And every time I'm in Lower Silesia, I'm traveling usually to my brother who lives in Jelenia Góra, which is like 120 kilometers southwest from Wrocław. And I'm surprised that in every of those like small hub stations that used to be just had abandoned branch lines, there are now some trains waiting for transfers. I've even seen some like Czech motoraks, this like rail buses from the 60s. Basically, they were now bought by some local Polish company, and they run them on some very remote rural railway. And we have also to remember that while these branch lines, they are not maybe like profitable on their own, they are acting as feeders for the main railway. So,
and also, one thing that Poland has done extremely well is basically the newly built stations on those lines. They might not be very charming, but they're built basically with a kit. So they have standard blocks for the platforms. They have standard blocks for the shelters where passengers wait. And so you can build a station on those lines for a very, very low cost. And one of the problems that you've often had particularly in Germany when they wanted to reopen lines like that is everyone says the cost of building the stations is too high. Now, Poland are the absolute masters of building maybe not charming, but functional stations in those places for a very, very low cost. It's really
especially that, let's remember that the old station building is still sitting behind the fence, falling apart.
Yeah.
So they are not like renovating what it used to be. They just provide very basic infrastructure just to let the trains run. Yeah.
But it's good enough. Mm-hmm. And that's the central point. You've got to get your basics right. And that's what Poland generally for its local transport is doing. Now, ask yourself this sort of question. Imagine you live in a village with 700 people. Your family is there and your children are going to the junior school in the village, but your job is in the local town, right? In Jelenia Góra, say. And then someone from your son's school phones you up and says, hey, your son has fallen ill in school. Can you come and pick him up because he's sick? Right? Now, how long would you wait for the next train back to the village? You might wait up to 1 hour, but probably not longer. Mm-hmm. Now, Poland, and particularly Lower Silesia, has got that exactly right. They basically say, if we have a line open, it has to have a regular train. It's got to run, maybe not every hour, but about minimum every 2 hours. You have the situation in many parts of Europe, and particularly in Western Europe, France and in Spain, where you have some lines where you have only 3 or 4 trains in the entire day. And that basically means that a family, for example, could never rely on the train. They would basically always say, hey, well, sorry, we can't wait half a day for the next one. We'll buy a car instead. Yeah. So it's really important, not necessarily the speed of your local train, but how reliable it is and how often that it will run. And that also is very, very important, also in border regions. And so we've seen the situation, particularly the Poland-Germany border, close to Szczecin. Mm-hmm. I probably said that wrong in Polish.
Szczecin, you were close enough.
I can't spit that out. I'm sorry. Where it is now cheaper to live on the German side of the border and work on the Polish side of the border. Now, if you want to persuade those people to go to work in the city by train, you need to also run the international train once per hour. You can't be having 5 international trains a day only. It has to be once an hour, like any good regional service. Mm. And so you've got to think of international rail not as a nice to have, but as a must have if you want to get those people out of their cars. And in many border regions, the France-Germany border around Freiburg, We see it there. There is the border Germany to Czechia south of Dresden. It's very important there. The Austria-Germany border, Freilassing to Salzburg. These border regions have become so integrated that people cross the border every single day. They're cross-border commuters. And we need to provide good cross-border railway services to allow those people to cross the border with a train, not just with a car.
I think we've noticed that only when COVID happened and they closed the borders, and we've seen how much difficulties it caused to those cross-border commuters. But also, like when it comes to this, like a corner, like southwest corner of Poland with Germany and with Czech Republic, this is called like Euro-NISA region. And I remember there were some like common tickets, even I think before we joined European Union, to promote this cross-border travels. And now I think last time I wrote on the Koleje Dolnośląskie train, there was some posters offering you like all-day ticket for all the buses and trains in the region across the three nations, which is brilliant and which is as it should be, basically.
Absolutely. And it's a super nice little route. So there's now one version of that train. It starts in Germany inside Hennersdorf. It goes into Czechia to Warnsdorf. It goes back into Germany to Zittau. It then transits a part of Poland for 2 kilometers, but doesn't stop there, and it ends up back in Czechia. So within 1 hour, you go Germany, Czechia, Germany, Poland, Czechia. It's super cool. I really love it.
Yeah, but we will come back to this project of yours, but I wanted to speak something about what you said about this reliability of the service. And just to give you an example, I used to live in Cambuslang, which is on the outskirts of Glasgow. And whenever I wanted to go to the town without taking my car, which is like only to the strict Glasgow city center, you can travel without a car because otherwise the transport is terrible. I remember I had to check when the train will be. I had to plan. And even though I lived like 4 minutes walk from the train station, just before I was leaving for the train, I was still checking on my mobile to see if the train is not delayed or cancelled. Right. Now I live on the like outskirts of Helsinki, and I don't check trains or buses at all. And it's went to such a degree that if I see the bus on the bus stop, I don't run for it because I can't be arsed because I know the next bus will be in like 4 minutes or something. This is what reliable and regular transport gives to you. You don't have to stress at all. This is why it's so important.
I was in a tiny village of 400 people outside of Berlin in Brandenburg, together with a friend on the weekend. And we had not planned our route back. And the friend said to me, "Did you look at the timetable for the route back?" And I said, "No, I didn't look at the timetable for the route back, but there will be a train. It'll be fine." And of course there was.
Right? Exactly.
Whereas every time when I'm in France, we're like, oh shit, how the hell are we going to plan this? Because there's going to be a gap of 3 hours in the timetable, right? Like reliable public transport with a good timetable that you can rely on is very, very important.
And it can be life-changing. There's even a song of the Polish band Skaldowie, which is called Dojeżdżam, I Commute. And it's a song when like it's sung from the a point of view of a high school student who cannot participate in any after-school activities, cultural like events, or even go out with the friends because he always have to run for the train because it's last train for a day and he cannot stay longer.
Right.
And this song is 50 years old, but there are still people in the smaller villages that are suffering in that way because they cannot have reliable public transport, especially in Poland when the public buses outside of the biggest cities are basically non-existent.
Of course, but look at it this way, right? Now, I get that point, and Poland is not paradise in that regard, but that ethos, that thinking about regular timetables is still there in Poland. It is definitely there in Czechia. It is there in Slovakia. It's definitely there in Germany. The Swiss are the masters at it. Austria, it's there. Slovenia, it's getting there steadily. Hungary, give or take, it's still pretty much there. Yeah. Many other railways in Western Europe, or particularly France, UK to some extent, Ireland, Spain, have reduced taking the train to something that you don't do every day. It is only something for the long distance. And that is a fatal error. That is wrong. It should be possible to live a self-directed life without needing a car. And, but not all of Europe is that. Not only is it not possible, but that does not feature as a political priority.
Mm-hmm. Which brings us back to the beginning of the conversation. But now let's talk about your project, because you mentioned that already. You did this project when you traveled by train across like all the borders, but are those like all the border crossings, or just you are not there yet?
I'm not there yet. So I started 2 years ago, where in one journey I crossed all of the internal borders of the EU that you can cross by train. So basically meaning any pair of countries, I crossed on at least one line there, right? But to give an example, there's something like 14 lines between Germany and Czechia. So I didn't go to all of them. I went to one, right? So I wanted an overview of, is it good, bad, or indifferent in any of these places? Why did I do that? It was because I discovered that back 7 years ago, the European Parliament had been investigating this problem and wondering why it was so hard to cross borders in border regions. And so I thought, okay, well, let's travel to these places and try and find out what works and what doesn't work in different parts of Europe. And are there things you could learn that it's going really well here, it's going less well there? How would you improve it? And so that's where it all started. And then since then, I've basically been filling in the gaps. So I went to 95 borders in 2022. And now my number at the moment stands at the time of this podcast, when we're recording it, 268 borders. I have made the definitive map of Europe's railway borders, current and former, so dismantled lines, and you end up with a total of something like 450 border lines, but at least 100 of those will never return because basically they were abandoned back decades ago due to war or due to redrawing borders at the end of a conflict, and they will never return. So ultimately, in the EU, there are something like 200 to 230 interesting railway borders, adding non-EU Europe and external borders of the European Union, and you hit something in the low 300s of interesting borders. And by the end of next year, I will have covered all of the interesting ones.
But let's mention that you go also to the places when you cannot cross by trains either, because as you mentioned, there are no longer railways in there. But also, I remember, for example, you were in Tornio, which is at the top of the Baltic Sea, and there are some train tracks from Finland to Sweden, but there are no passenger trains, which will that be even feasible? It's not exactly.
So that's actually it's financially a bit problematic. So the Tornio Haparanda, it's a wonderful place. I can highly recommend going there as well. It's like, oh, yeah, I got there on a nice sunny day, so that made it better. At the moment, there's only freight across the border there, but the regions of northern Finland fully intend to fix that. They just haven't found the necessary public subsidy to run the trains. But basically, they will extend trains from Rovaniemi and or Oulu as far as Haparanda on the Swedish side. It might happen already in December of this year. Or it might take until some point next year because they needed to put up the electrification masts on the line. But
also there are different railway coaches in Sweden.
There are, but what will simply happen is you'll change trains in Haparanda. You'll change off the Finnish broad gauge train, cross the platform, and there'll be a Swedish standard gauge train waiting for you. So no high-tech, swanky, multi-gauge train solutions. Just a very simple solution. You change from one train to another, but in the same station. At the moment, there's 5 kilometers missing to cross there. And indeed, there's not even a bus actually most days. You actually have to walk the 5 kilometers from Tornio to Haparanda at the moment. But they will at least mean it will be organized so as you can travel through there. Now, it's a very important point. I don't care if you have to change trains. if it's done in a good way, right, you need a timetable which is actually workable. So Tornio Haparanda, it will get fixed. I don't know whether it will be the end of this year or whether it will be next year sometime, but that one will get repaired. So basically, for my project, there are 4 types of problems which you encounter at borders. The first is there used to be a line and it fell into disrepair for some reason. Could you rebuild it? Now, these are often really expensive and very hard to fix. So I haven't really found very many of those where you could really do much with those circumstances. I've only a handful. The second is there are tracks, but there are no passenger trains running there. So that's like the Tornio Haparanda problem, right? How hard would it be to extend the train across the border? There is, for example, the Germany-Poland border from Weglinitz, anyway, north of Görlitz to Horka on the German side. There is a track there, but it's only used by goods trains. Could you, for example, also run passenger trains there? So that's the second problem. The third problem is, and we talked a bit about it earlier, there are trains, but you can't get a good ticket for those trains, right? So that's the case at Forst-Lausitz. It's the case at many of the France-Spain borders, for example. And the fourth category is there are good train services, but there is some kind sorry, I'm getting my list mixed up. The fourth category is there is a timetable problem. So there are trains, but, for example, the train arrives at the border station, but you have to wait hours until the train departs on the other side. So
let's say hello now to the Baltic states.
Right. To Tallinn to Riga, for example, you get stuck at Valga with exactly that type of problem. Or there is a similar problem going through the Alps, although the track's blocked by a landslide at the moment. But if you wanted to go from Lyon through to Torino, for example, on regional trains, you face the same problem there. So basically, missing tracks, missing services, bad timetables, or bad ticketing. Those are the 4 different problems that you basically face in border regions. And I'm steadily working this through border by border by border to say, this is what you would need to do to fix the problem in a given place.
Mm-hmm. So what are the stupidest things you've seen?
So the one that sticks most in my mind is a village. I think I've made this village famous by now. The village Turmantas of 286 people on the border of Lithuania to Latvia. So Turmantas is just 2 kilometers from the border. It has 5 trains a day to and from Vilnius. But 20 kilometers after the border is the second city of Latvia, Daugavpils. And there is a train line, but due to a dispute about the cost of a few liters of diesel fuel, the trains that used to run Vilnius, Turmantas, Daugavpils now don't cross the border and they turn round in Turmantas. Now, when I was there on my bicycle crossing this border on a dirt road, I saw passengers coming on a bus on the dirt road to the last village in Latvia and crossing the border on foot to take the train on the Lithuanian side, right? Like, this is a matter of a few liters of diesel fuel each day. The train is there, the track is there is no technical problem, and you could connect the second city of Latvia to the capital city of Lithuania with no problem at all, and it would be absolutely fine. Right? Like, that is just an insane circumstance. That makes me mad.
And I can risk a guess that a bus driving on the dirt road is probably using more diesel fuel than a train riding on the flat metal rails.
Could well be. Anyway, so that's perhaps the craziest circumstance that I encountered. There's a big problem between Romania and Bulgaria. Despite the fact that the European Commissioner for Transport, the outgoing one, is from Romania, they've still not managed to get this in check. There are 3 very desolate railway lines, one from Craiova towards Vidin on the Bulgarian side, and 2 which go to Rus, so basically south of Bucharest. And they are in a horrible, decrepit state, and that makes getting to Bulgaria by train very, very difficult. The situation in Greece is very, very sad. There are 5 international railway lines from Greece, 2 to North Macedonia, 2 to Bulgaria, and 1 to Turkey. Only 2 of the 5 are active, and those 2 do not have passenger trains. So that's a sad and ridiculous circumstance. So yeah, these are all of the types of circumstances that make you disappointed. Yeah, there's lots to do.
Okay, and what would be like a success stories? We already mentioned this Euronissa region, which is Poland, Czech, and
right. So the nicest success story that I've managed to, or 2 I've managed to kind of help along. Right, I can't take full responsibility for these, but like stories I followed. One is on the edge of that Euronissa region is the town Zeifhennersdorf. Now, Zeifhennersdorf is a strange situation. The town is in Germany, but you can only get to the rest of Germany by crossing 4 kilometers of Czechia. And as a result of a dispute between the network operator in Czechia and the network operator in Germany, and there are very dangerous level crossing on the road at the entrance to Zeifhennersdorf, the trains were replaced by buses for 8 years to Zeifhennersdorf. Anyway, I went to Zeifhennersdorf. It's a quite poor town in Sachsen, heavily votes for the populist right wing. But I went to the street party, basically, for the launch of the new train connection, because finally, after 8 years, they reactivated the railway line. And it was brilliant, because everyone was having a big party about it. Now, that's actually what the train meant to people in a town like that. And it was a really, really great thing to see. So that was one. And the second is a little success story at the border of France to Spain, at the Atlantic coast, between the towns of Hendaye and Irun. Now there has always been a good train, but it's run by the Basque government, and they never uploaded the timetables for the trains to the international timetable database. So the train ran, but you needed specialist knowledge to even know when it would go. Anyway, so now finally, after having worked this through with lots of different political actors for a long time, I finally got the data on that train called Euskotren to be in the international timetable databases. So that one has actually finally got fixed. But overall, the places I really like are the places where it's the international train runs really, really often. So, for example, the Öresund Bridge between Copenhagen and Malmö in Sweden, the train runs there every 20 minutes all day through. And that means you don't have to think about it. You just go to the railway station and it'll be maximum 20 minutes until the next train is going. And that has basically built a whole region there. There are people that live in Malmö and work in Copenhagen. There are people to even connect to Copenhagen's airport, where from the Swedish side, you fly from the Copenhagen airport. It's really brought a whole region together. So that long predates my work on railways, but that's a really nice case where if you build a good international railway connection, it makes a transformative change to a region. And that's a really good case.
Yeah, because that's, I think, it's another aspect, because sometimes we can discuss, okay, is that really like sensible to send this train on this like mountain route and so on? But actually, we have to remember that those connections also help build communities. I can see, for example, well, I'm no longer living there, but I speak with my friends and I see where my friends are going hiking to the hills, for example. So they all used to hike on the Polish sides only. And now, because there's so many of cross-border trains to Czech Republic, they start to explore the Czech side as well, which is good for tourists. And when I'm in Jelenia Góra, I can see like Czech tourists, which was not too popular in the past when I used to live closer and be regular there. So there is also this cultural aspect and like international exchange aspect and tourism aspect and everything.
A really good train is used by all kinds of people. Young, old, families, hikers, tourists, mountain bikers, commuters, any type of person in the society. And that's what you see in some regions of Poland. That's what you see in Czechia. That's what you see in Austria. That's a healthy railway system when you have that mix. So, actually, before I go to the last
topic, I wanted to give you some funny digression, which has no relation, but I just found it funny when you spoke about this Basque train that has no timetable. So I was once in Isle of Barra in Scottish Outer Hebrides. Well, I was there several times, but I was once only as a tourist. And there are bus stops there, but there are no timetables on the bus stops. And it's funny because when there's a bus stop and you like stand and don't know what to expect, and there are some people in the house nearby, so you come to these people and you ask, excuse me, do you know when the bus will come? And the people, that happened to me at least 3 times, people say, oh, well, I don't know, nobody knows where the buses comes, don't worry, I get my car and I will drive you whenever you need to. So that's other way to build a community in relations with tourists, I guess. But that was a digression. And now let's go to this. That will be a bit, because we will publish this podcast a bit later to compare to when we record it. But you mentioned before we went recording that there are some changes in the politics and we can expect a new commissioner to deal with the trains. So what that would matter for the trains and for European network?
Right. So every 5 years, we have a new team of European commissioners. And out of that team of 27 commissioners, one gets the portfolio of transport policy. So we've had for the last 5 years, Adina Valian, a conservative politician from Romania, who has been responsible for European transport policy. I would say that Adina Valian has nothing against railways. I would not allege a bias or something, but she has not been an effective politician. She has not been willing to make the necessary changes at the European Union level to facilitate cross-border railway routes. Now, at the time of us recording this podcast, we don't know who her successor as European Commissioner for Transport is going to be, but we do know one thing. We know the future president of the European Commission is going to be like the outgoing president, Ursula von der Leyen, the German politician. And we know that in her political priorities for the next 5 years, Ursula von der Leyen has a political commitment to fix European cross-border passenger rail ticketing. It is stated in her political priorities. This basically means the idea that you should be able to book in one transaction a train ticket from any town to any other town in the European Union, providing there's a railway station in those two places. And if something goes wrong, still not be left stranded somewhere. So basically meaning you would have passenger rights, is a stated political priority for the next European Commission to fix. And so I have a little bit of optimism that at least, if not, it won't become cheaper to book trains Europe-wide, but it will at least become easier. And that might at least persuade a few more people to take the train. Now, at the moment, we don't know who a future European Commissioner for Transport is going to be. There are a couple of countries that are rumored to want that portfolio. They are Finland and Greece at the moment. Neither two countries that are so central to Europe's railways, but at least there is a good functioning railway network in Finland. So that would be my hope, that it would be the Finnish nominee that would manage to get that portfolio. But that person would have an immediate opportunity would be for fixing railway ticketing. And it is the European Commission that has the right of legislative initiative. So it is them that would put forward a future law to improve European railway ticketing. And so therefore, I'm a little bit hopeful that in the next couple of years, we might actually finally get that then finally fixed.
Okay. So let's hope that will be just the first step to do so. To fix the European railways, because I have to say, after moving to Helsinki, I just can't wait for this Rail Baltica to be finished, because I hate flying. I like flying a plane, but I hate traveling by airlines.
Yeah.
So I drive there regularly, and I've seen how Flixbuses are driving there, and I told to myself I will never get on one of those buses because those guys are crazy. So driving is nice, but I would rather sit comfortable in the train and take the views. So,
so that's to me would be a secondary priority once we fix the ticketing one. That's the kind of lowest hanging fruit to fix, basically. The European Union has its so-called trans-European networks corridors, right? They are Europe-wide railway corridors where national governments can get European Union money to rebuild their railway lines, or indeed build ones from scratch. And so that Rail Baltica route, so Tallinn, Riga, Kaunas, Warszawa, is one of those routes. The problem is that those three countries, notably Latvia, are delayed with the implementation of the project, and the finances are running short. So Rail Baltica will get built, but whether it will actually get done by the end of this decade, that's going to be quite a tight timetable. But eventually you will get your train from near to Helsinki, a boat first and then a train, to be able to finally get to Poland.
Yeah, although it's also interesting when you look at what the countries are doing, and I've noticed, I think I may be wrong, but I think Estonia is taking this like Polish approach, so to speak, because you mentioned that before. So they are building the basic infrastructure, like the trains, platforms, and so on, so the trains can run as soon as possible. While in Latvia, for example, they build these posh train stations by famous architects, but train station is useless when the trucks are not leading to it.
And every time there is a new government and political instability is a major problem in Latvia, they then stop the building works only to then restart them again. And so honestly, the Latvia is at the moment the weak link in the entire Rail Baltica project. I did have my fears about the Polish aspect of the project for a while, but actually the building works are coming along quite well there now. So it's
I think it's ready, because I know there are already.
No, it's not ready yet. There's a backup at the moment, right? There's a single track diesel line from the border station Mokava which is just on the Lithuanian side of the border. So you can run something. But what Poland is doing is, instead of building a whole new line, is they are rebuilding and reactivating a line from Suwałki to Elk, and then from there to Białystok. And so that part, there is an old line that currently exists, but they're basically rebuilding and reconstructing for 200 kilometers an hour a parallel line. So at the moment, the old line is still operational, but the new one or the renovated one is not yet finished. But Poland will have that done long before Latvia has completed its station. So no fear there.
Yeah, but what I meant is that it's ready as if the trains can already run on it. So because, as I said, I would rather have a train that travels 120 kilometers per hour than not having a bullet train.
Honestly, beyond Suwałki, it's more like 50 kilometers an hour at the moment. But yeah, there is at least one train per day with a guaranteed connection in Mokava, the border station, to go from Warszawa to Vilnius. So that's at least progress. And also the new train from Vilnius to Riga is actually a modern, comfortable train, a very good train. Again, unfortunately, only once per day. So at least I feel that at least Lithuania has kind of turned the corner. They realize there's an immense potential in their railway network, and things are really looking up. And it's the same in Estonia as well. It's still problematic in Latvia, though, unfortunately. That's definitely the weakest link.
Okay, so to end on the lighter route, you've been in almost or over 200 border crossings, so you've been in some nice lines. So tell me, if you are a railway fan and want to take some really scenic route across the border, which one was your favorite?
So I really love the one at the border at Bayerisch Eisenstein. So this is a tiny, tiny border station between Bavaria and Czechia. So it's basically northeast from Munich. Wonderful rolling hills, wooden forests, tiny little train, and this enormous border station where the border goes right through the middle of the station building, like literally through the building. And it's this wonderful, charming spot. It has tiny village, but wonderful forests, nice place to sit and have a coffee or a beer under a tree, and with a really good railway service. So I really love that one. So if you ever have the opportunity to go to Bayerisch Eisenstein, I can highly recommend it. And another one, which is just stunning, although the trains only work on the Spanish side at the moment, is the France-Spain border at Canfranc in the middle of the Pyrenees, which has this, again, a majestic, huge railway station. But unfortunately, the trains don't work on the French side at the moment, but they might do by the end of the decade. So that's another one, which is just an amazing and incredible place. So, yeah, those are my two, which are the kind of favorite scenic places to go.
One more question on technicality. Do you use like Eurorail cards or something, or you just so that's worth it.
So
if you travel a lot,
so all my projects are done using Interrail, which is the name for the passes if you live in the EU. Eurorail is the name of basically an equivalent product for people who live outside of Europe. If you are traveling anything more than a return trip, right? So you're making like 3 days of train travels in a month, and you're going a long distance, it will almost certainly be cheaper to do it with an Interrail pass than it will to buy regular tickets. So, for example, you can do, if I were doing a Berlin to Glasgow and back, it would be cheaper to do that with an Interrail pass than it would to do it with regular tickets. And so that's how I managed to keep my costs down. And indeed, Interrail, it has this reputation as a student product, but anyone can use it. It just costs a bit more if you're over 26. And you can also take children with you. I think up until the age of 13, they can go for free. And so that is a way that if you're doing kind of a tour by train, you can really, really reduce your costs. So yeah, certainly if you want to do a kind of tourism by rail, and you're just using Interrail tickets all the time.
Okay, and actually there's one thing I forgot to ask, so sorry for like dropping that at the end of the podcast, but are the ferries interconnected with railways? Does anybody actually works towards that? So say I can take a ferry and then take the train. I'm not talking about like ferries on trains as in Puttgarden or whatever. I'm talking like comfortable ways. Say I'm going to Helsinki, I'm taking the ferry to Travemünde, and then I got train somehow connected to this ferry terminal, even by bus that I can. Is that sort of?
Sort of. It used to be much better often when there used to be dedicated train services to ferry terminals. So, for example, you can take the train to the ferry terminal at Harwich in eastern England and take a ferry from there to Hoek van Holland in the Netherlands, and it works in a combined ticket. You can also do the same across the Irish Sea between Holyhead and Dublin, where the train takes you basically the whole way to the ferry port on the UK side. There's a good example for you there in Finland, because there is a train station at the ferry terminal in Turku, and that's then the fastest way of train plus ferry to get to Stockholm. You take the Helsinki to Turku port station, and then you have to walk like 100 meters to get onto the ferry. The problem is often that you don't have passenger rights, basically meaning if the train gets delayed and you miss the ferry, or the ferry gets delayed and you miss the train, you can get left stranded. So in a few places in Europe, it works. In a few other places, you get left in the middle of nowhere. So I've taken a ferry to Malmö, for example, from Travemünde, and the Malmö ferry port is like absolutely like kilometers and kilometers outside of Malmö. It's a really long cycle route to even get out to the ferry terminal. So it depends on the route, but in a few places in Europe, yes, it works, but it's far from universal.
So when we are talking about this like passenger rights for the railways, we should also include ferries and
exactly. Well, you should also find a way of including buses in it. If my journey includes a bus, a train, and a ferry, I should be just as well covered as if my journey contains 2 trains, right? Okay. Because ultimately, also for like, if I want to make a journey also which involves flights, right? So imagine a route, say, Brussels in Belgium to Graz in Austria, right? There is no flight from Brussels to Graz. You would fly from Brussels to Munich and fly from Munich to Graz. Whereas actually the more environmentally friendly option is fly from Brussels to Vienna and take a train from Vienna to Graz. Now, the problem is you can't actually book that in one transaction. And even if you did, you would be in danger of being left stranded because you wouldn't have any passenger rights. Now, if the European Union were serious about that type of thing, it should also be making sure of getting connecting flight passengers onto trains or onto buses as well if you wanted to. For the short connecting leg, you should replace those short connecting flights with trains or buses instead. But at the moment, we don't have a proper legal framework for that in the European Union either, unfortunately.
So that will be something to think for that new
For the new European Commission for Transport. Yeah. One step at a time. Let's fix railway ticketing first, and then we move to multimodal ticketing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so keep up the good work. If you want to follow John, he got a blog and he's very active in Mastodon as well. So we put the links to your social media. And do you want to add something at the end? Maybe I missed something. Maybe I should ask something. Is there anything?
I think we covered all the main topics, but basically, if you're struggling to take a train Europe-wide, ask online. The railway companies don't always know all of the answers to those questions, but somewhere, some crazy committed traveler will know the answer. So we, as a community of people who are trying to do this, we are hacking our way around the system. So contact me via social media. If I can't answer, I will know someone who can, and we'll help you book your Europe-wide railway tickets. So for now, don't be disheartened by it. We'll find a way of helping you get to your destination one way or another.
Okay, then. Thank you very much. And I wish you many safe railway journeys as much as I wish it to everyone else, so we can be finally able to do it without so much hassle as you sometimes have to suffer for us. So thank you again. Our guest was John Worth, a guy who likes trains.
Żeby zdążyć do pociągu, to był schemat, to był temat tamtych dni. Inni śmieli się przy szachach i ping-pongu, a mnie czekał senny peron w sennej wsi.
Coś ty taki smutny, coś ty taki inny, coś ty taki nudny, to jestem mu winny. Gdzie ty masz parasol? Przecież będzie deszcz lał.
Rano było ładnie, widzisz, ja dojeżdżam. Aż tu dzisiaj pociąg uciekł mi ostatni, a ja na to jak na lato jedź, że hej. Trzymam w ręce zawstydzone